All right. So I just want to welcome everybody and say how happy I am that you've all joined us today. I think this is going to be a very interesting topic. I have to say, as I was reading material for it, I really was struck by how wondrous and complicated we human beings are. And it also gave me a great feeling of compassion for myself and for the rest of us, because we not only have to deal with all kinds of stuff in the outside world, but every day we're also dealing with stuff on the inside world. And as you come to understand just how powerful your unconscious is, you'll realize what a challenge it is to just make our way through life. So I just want to say, I think we have to have compassion for ourselves and each other, because it is a challenge and we're all out here doing the best we can. So I just want to say, when you feel lost and you don't know what to do in your life, always come back to the touchstone of compassion for yourself and others. It will always lead you in the right direction. So what is the subconscious mind? What do we mean by that? It's a term it's a term that was popularized by Freud, but it's a concept that's been around for many, many years. This idea that there are things operating below the awareness of our conscious mind that do have an impact on us. Again, Freud popularized it, but it's been around for a very long time. Freud suggested we had sort of three levels of awareness within our psyches, within our minds. The conscious mind is just what you think it is. It's all the thoughts, the feelings, the actions that are within our awareness. Ramsey wrote, all of the thoughts that pass through your mind, the sensations and perceptions from the outside world, and the memories that you bring into your awareness are all part of that conscious experience. So conscious is just what it sounds like. It's the stuff we're aware of. Now, the subconscious mind contains all those reactions and automatic actions that we become aware of if we think about them, but we're not always necessarily aware of them all the time. For example, if I said right now, do you feel any sensations in your right foot? You would suddenly become aware of your right foot. Now, before that, you probably didn't notice how your right foot was feeling, but it wasn't as if it wasn't accessible to you. It was just sort of running in the background. So that's the one level just below the conscious mind, is what Freud called the subconscious mind. So it's generally operating below our level of awareness, but you can bring it into awareness. An example is just breathing, or anything that you can do automatically, from driving a car, or a pianist who plays the piano. If you play the piano, it can be happening just below your conscious awareness because it's so automatic for you. But you could bring your attention to it, and you could alter your breathing. You could change your piano playing. So you can bring your awareness to it, but it's sort of just running automatically for the most part. Now, the unconscious mind, that's made up of all the thoughts, memories, primitive and instinctual drives that are buried deep within ourselves, far below our conscious awareness. And even though we're not aware of them, they are having a profound impact on us at all times. And you're going to hear some pretty startling stories that really confirm that. Freud viewed the unconscious as kind of a reservoir, repository for kind of socially unacceptable ideas or feelings or wishes or desires. So the stuff that we didn't think would be okay to feel, we buried it somewhere below our level of conscious awareness. So it's also the place where traumatic memories or painful experiences have been put out of our mind by a mechanism such as psychological repression. So we've buried stuff, we've repressed it, we've put it out of our conscious awareness, usually in some ways to protect ourselves from painful memories. But I'll also explain why in some ways things that happen to us as a child are recorded in the right hemisphere in the brain, which makes them difficult to access in a traditional sense. So it's actually also how those memories were recorded when we were young, but I'll get into that. A good example of something that's kind of operating on the unconscious level is maybe something like internalized racism. It's a good example of the unconscious because, and I'm going to quote here, psychologists and mental health professionals believe that even if we're consciously against racist ideology, everyone is likely to have some conditioning of internalized racism. So that's something that's operating at a less conscious level. Again, many of us are very committed to not being racist, but we probably grew up being exposed to racist ideas and thoughts. And so some of those may be harbored still in our subconscious mind or unconscious mind. That's just an example of something like that. So this model is often described as an iceberg. If you have my handout, I depicted it as an iceberg. In fact, Freud said, the mind is like an iceberg. It floats with 1/7 of its bulk above the water. So 1/7 of that little iceberg is showing above the surface, and the bulk of it, the mass majority of it, is just below the surface. And that really is true for us. So you're saying, okay, where's the proof? What kind of proof do we have that there is this subconscious or unconscious mind? And these questions have been sort of the focus of psychology and other dimensions like neuroscience for a long time. How those levels of awareness affect one another is kind of one of the most intriguing questions in my field. So it's not really possible to observe different levels of the mind directly. It's not like they can run a PET scan and see, the subconscious mind, the unconscious, the subconscious, the conscious. It doesn't work like that. But there's a significant body of research that's validated the influence of the subconscious mind by observing things like the effects of priming, and I'll explain what that means. It means sort of introducing a stimulus into an environment that will affect another stimulus. So priming us, like, you prime yourself maybe before you go to work, say, I'm going to have a good day today. That's priming. Talk about that. But also subliminal messages and images. There's tons of research. We'll talk about it. That shows really things that are flashed even briefly on a screen flash so quickly that you can't be consciously aware that you saw it. But the research would suggest you did see it, and we'll talk about how they know that. So those things kind of all really kind of validate the reality of the unconscious mind. And while Freud popularized the idea of the unconscious mind, he really was only interested in clinical observation as the source of his data, so to speak. He drew his truth from his experiences with his clients, and not necessarily scientific data. But since then, a great deal of scientific research has been done in this area. I'm going to quote, in recent years, however, a large body of experimental research has emerged in a number of important and independent literatures. This work documents the most fundamental tenet of psychoanalysis, that much of the mental life is unconscious, including cognitive, affective, and motivational processes. So that's someone who's written about the research in the unconscious. He's saying that we're finding out that there is a great deal happening below the surface that affects how we think, how we feel, and what motivates us and why we do the things that we do. He cites a number of studies in the scientific community that have found evidence of the subconscious mind. For example, we once we learn a skill, we generally don't have to think about it. So once you learn how to ride a bike, you don't have to consciously think how to ride a bike. You did when you were first starting out, same with the car. But once you've learned how to do it, it kind of runs in an automatic sense, just below the level of consciousness. I'm sure you've had times when you're driving along and you've been daydreaming or thinking about something else, and all of a sudden you kind of look, it's not like you're not noticing if cars are cutting you off. You're aware enough that you're keeping yourself safe, but you might suddenly kind of go, oh, I don't remember the last 2 miles. I mean, when we really learn something well, it becomes sort of automatic. And then it really is being driven more by the subconscious mind, not the unconscious. It's not aware. We can't access it. We don't need to access it. Its neural pathways are sort of just causing us to do these sort of automatic things. So once we learn a skill, we don't need to consciously think about it, or a baseball, drive a car. He also says that we see evidence of the subconscious mind or the unconscious mind in evidence of associative memory. What he means by that is we have lots of associations that are outside of our conscious awareness, but they do guide our behavior. He gave it as an example, a study where they primed the people who are going to do a task with, somehow they mentioned the word dog in the course of talking to these people. And then the people had letters flashed on the screen, and they had to guess what word was being spelled. And so they get 1 letter, then 2 letters, then 3 letters, then guess as soon as they could as to what the word was. And what they found was if they had primed people with the word dog, they were much quicker to identify the word terrier. So within 3 letters, they were saying terrier, as opposed to people who did not have the word dog mentioned to them at any time prior to the study. So people who had heard the word dog, so we're sort of primed to think in terms of dogs, guessed the word terrier with 3 letters, whereas the people who had had that word didn't guess terrier quite so quickly. So it says that sort of we make these associations in our brain that we aren't even aware of that do influence us. And so this is what they concluded is, according to our model, priming with the word dog activates a network of associations, spreading activation to anything on the network. So it's as if the things that are linked together in your brain, once one word triggers those associations, you will more quickly respond to triggers or anything else that's also associated with that. That's probably what lies at the root of our having very strong emotional reactions to something that's what we call a trigger, something we may not be conscious of, but it is something that stirs up feelings that are related to something else. A really easy example, I had a student who had been sexually assaulted, and she went back to her home in Boston, then went back to her home in New Jersey, and her boss, she went on to the job, and her boss looked a lot like the man who had assaulted her. And she called me from underneath her desk, just unable to function. She was just frozen in place. Now, that's an obvious overt trigger, but sometimes it's more subtle. It can be a smell. It can be just anything that's associated with a trauma can bring you back as if it was yesterday. That's kind of what flashbacks are. Something you're not even consciously aware of triggers a memory. One thing that I thought was always very striking to me when I worked with rape survivors was how many would have a reaction on the day that was like the 1 year anniversary, the 2 year anniversary, and they hadn't even realized what the date was. They hadn't even made a conscious, they weren't consciously aware of the fact that the day was an anniversary. And yet they were having terrible symptoms and terrible flashbacks, and they suddenly looked at a calendar and they put it together. So help me God, I can't tell you how many of my clients told me that. So it really said to me that, boy, somewhere in our brain, we really did have a date associated with that trauma. So let me just give you a few other examples. Sean Anker wrote a great book called The Happiness Advantage. And he cites a lot of studies on the power of priming positively or negatively. And you'll understand what priming is when I explain these samples, these studies to you. The first one he called Jello at Lunch. It was a study where they took 4-year-olds who were going to give a series of tasks to complete, like putting blocks of similar sizes together. So they had some kind of little task they had to perform with their blocks. They found that if they took people and they told them, if they asked the kids, half the group, they asked them to think of something positive before they started their task. So they figured they probably were thinking about things like Jello, which is why they call it the Jello for Lunch program. So what they did was they had the kids think of just something positive, something that made them happy. And then they asked them to perform this task with the blocks. The other half, they didn't ask them to think about anything positive. They just gave them the task and they performed it. Well, no surprise, those who were even briefly primed in a positive way by just thinking of something that made them happy did the task faster and more successfully. So that's really telling. You just said to a kid, think of something positive, and that group of kids did better than the other group of kids who were not asked to think about that. That's the power of positive priming. You're priming yourself for success. Now, you think that's just something kids would do, but guess what? They had another study they called Give the Doc a Lollipop. What they found was that they gave doctors a task where they had to look at a hypothetical set of symptoms and come up with a diagnosis. And I think decide what tests they would order. And they set it up so that one diagnosis looked sort of obvious, but if you really looked carefully at the case, you would realize that was kind of that really wasn't the diagnosis. You really had to look at something else. It was a little more complicated. But anyhow, what they did was half the group, they gave them a box of chocolates. They gave the doctors, here's a box of chocolates. Thanks for coming in and doing this study. They didn't let them eat the chocolates because they didn't want something like the blood sugar to affect the outcome. They just gave them a box of chocolates to take home. Well, guess what? The doctors who were given a box of chocolates to take home, they weren't allowed to eat them, but they took home, outperformed the doctors who were not given anything. The happy doctors made the right diagnosis much faster and exhibited more creativity in coming up with their diagnosis. So just giving them a box of candy to take home made them feel so positive that they actually worked more effectively. I think that says a heck of a lot. There's another study that they called poison ivy. Japanese researchers, and I don't know how they got away with this. You probably couldn't do this in America. Japanese researchers blindfolded a group of children, a group of students, and they told them that their arms were being rubbed with poison ivy. So they blindfolded them, they rubbed them with something with poison ivy. Not surprisingly, afterwards, all 13 people developed classic symptoms of poison ivy: itching, boils, and redness. And this happened even though they actually had not had poison ivy rubbed on them. They actually had rubbed on them something that was a harmless plant that should not have created any kind of reaction. But the fact that they were told that it was poison ivy created the symptoms of poison ivy, which is really startling, isn't it? Even more interesting was they took the same 13 students on the other arm. They said they were rubbing something that was completely harmless. In fact, on that arm, they were rubbing the poison ivy. But out of the 13 students, only 2 developed symptoms of poison ivy, even though the students were apparently all very allergic to poison ivy. But whether they thought it was poison ivy or didn't think it was poison ivy completely not only influenced what they thought was happening, but it actually influenced how the body reacted. So I think that's pretty startling. That's pretty powerful evidence of something that can happen on a subliminal or unconscious level. Other research also confirms the influence of information that isn't even perceived consciously. In fact, one study had participants rate the friendliness of a hypothetical person that they read about. So they read a little description about somebody and they were asked to rate, like, were they friendly or not friendly? Before they came to the lab, on their way to the lab, They were bumped into by a lab assistant. Now he stopped to pick stuff up and he asked them to hold his cup of coffee. So in some cases, the cup of coffee was a cold cup of coffee. In some cases, the cup of coffee was a hot cup of coffee. Guess what? Those who were handed a hot cup of coffee, a cold cup of coffee rated hypothetical people as colder, less social, and selfish, whereas those who were given a hot cup of coffee just to hold momentarily rated people as more generous, more happy, more social, and better natured. So just holding that cup of coffee, hot or cold, influenced how they imagined the person they were reading about was, whether they were friendly or not. And of course, this had to be raised to a statistically significant level, which means it wasn't random. Consistently, the people who held a hot cup of coffee rated people as friendlier, which I think is pretty telling. So if you want someone to think positively of you, ask them to hold a hot cup of coffee just for a split second. So people now say that really the research, the evidence that the brain can be sort of psychologically hot-wired or primed or swayed in some way by influences that we're not consciously aware of. It's now overwhelming, the amount of research. I could read you study after study, but I'm just going to give you a few more. But it's really consistently found that you really can be profoundly influenced by something very minor. Another study, this was really interesting. Participants were engaged in an activity that involved deciding how much money they were going to share with another study participant. So they had $10, and I think they were allowed to decide how they wanted to split it with the other person. They knew that if it was too bad a deal and the person said no, everybody lost the money. So they had some need to offer something they thought would possibly be acceptable. So they couldn't just keep all the money for themselves, or the game would have failed because the person would have rejected their offer. So they had to come up with an offer that person would accept, but they had a lot of wiggle room. Well, what they did was some of the participants who did the study were seated in a large conference table, where at the end of the table, there was a briefcase and a leather portfolio, just sitting there at the end of the table. They were also given kind of an executive style pen for writing down answers and things. The other participants were also seated at a big table, but at the end of that table was a backpack, and they were given just a traditional wooden pencil. What they found was that those who were in the room with the briefcase were far stingier than those in the room with the backpack. So it seems like the briefcase, the executive pen, all those triggered a greater sense of competitiveness in the people who were just had that briefcase in the room. And in fact, after they were done, they asked them to list all the factors they felt had influenced their decision, how they played the game. No one ever mentioned the briefcase or the backpack. So the influence of those two things was clearly unconscious. They were not aware that that had any influence on them. And yet, statistically significant, the people that were with the briefcase acted more competitive and were stingier. The people with the backpack were friendlier. So I think we have to make briefcases a thing of the past and just have backpacks in our workplaces. All right, another study. Just having the presence of a bucket wasn't even really close to them, but people went into a room, they had to complete a task. And in half the cases, there was also a bucket with a splash of citrus smelling detergent in it. So a little bit of a smell of a cleaning agent in the room. And then they were given a biscuit to eat. I think this is a British study because I don't think we eat biscuits. But anyhow, they were given a biscuit to eat, which was very messy. And then what they did was they observed how much the people cleaned up the messy biscuit. What they found was that those who had smelled the cleaning fluid cleared away crumbs 3 times more often than those who had no scent in the room. So just that smell of cleaning detergent increased the likelihood that they would spend more time cleaning up any mess they made with their biscuit. So talk about a subliminal trigger. Now, this is another study I think is very timely and something to think about. Another study analyzed the role of fear and feelings of vulnerability on racist attitudes. So the researchers examined situations that had examined whether a situation that induced a feeling of vulnerability, a darkened room, we wanted to see if that would increase the likelihood of white people responding in very biased ways toward Black people. And what they found, in fact, was that white participants were more likely to rate the neutral faces of African-American men as hostile if they were completing the task in a darkened room, as opposed to people who completed the exact same task, but with the lights up. So just the mere introduction of maybe a sense of greater vulnerability by turning off the lights in the room where they had to complete the task increased the likelihood that they saw pictures of Black men and rated them as hostile, as compared to people who were in a fully lit room who were less likely to rate those faces as hostile, which I think is really telling. They also found that um, they also gave everybody a questionnaire before they did this called it's called the Belief in a Dangerous World. It's a scale that people fill out, and it kind of measures whether you have kind of chronic concerns about your vulnerability to danger, like whether the world is a dangerous place. So they figured out who among those participants had a higher level of just general anxiety and fear about the world as a dangerous place. They called the Belief in a Dangerous World scale. And what they found was, of course, not surprising. Those who scored high on that scale and generally had a lot of anxiety about their safety in the world were more likely to make racist assumptions. So what this study really showed was that both temporary, like darkened room, and chronic feelings of vulnerability as measured by that scale increase the likelihood that Caucasians will perceive African Americans as hostile, which I think says a lot about the ease with which we can draw out people's racism or encourage racism by making people feel afraid or vulnerable. They also found that, as another study, the same researchers, they had white subjects rate the faces of apparently Arabic people with Arabic ethnicity. Again, they did it in a dark room. They did it under a well-lit room. And while all the photographs depicted people with neutral facial expressions, the participants were told that the targets were, when they were being photographed, they were deliberately trying to mask an emotion they were feeling. So they were told that this is somebody who's trying to mask an emotion when we took their photograph. And they want you to figure out, they would ask the participants what emotion they thought the person was trying to hide. It could have been sadness, it could have been anger, it could have been happiness, fear. So they had to rate a person, the target person, the picture they were looking at, and decide what emotion they felt that person was trying to bury. Well, they found two things. First, those who already had negative stereotypic thinking about people of Arabic descent were much more likely to think that the people were trying to repress feelings of anger. And they also said fearful participants perceived greater anger, but not any of the other emotions, not sadness, not joy, any of those, just anger. Fearful people who were fearful because the lights were turned out were more likely to perceive anger in the faces of the Arab, but not the white participants. So they saw pictures of Arab people, they saw pictures of white people. They were much more likely to guess that the Arabic people were actually holding down feelings of anger, much more so than the white people. And in this case, if they had a prejudicial attitude toward Arabs going in because they measured that, that only exacerbated. So again, both the temporary conditions of anxiety or vulnerability, which is the darkened room versus a well-lit room, and then the more chronic anxiety, which is measured by the amount of stereotypes people already had going into the study, both of those things really influenced whether people were likely to project onto a group other than their own group, the likelihood that they're really angry and they were trying to hide their anger. So I think, especially given these times when, we do see some, in some cases, people sort of heightening people's fear around the other Arabic, African American, that we are going to actually, that playing on people's fear, this really good research suggests that it's going to bring out even greater bias and prejudice in people. And maybe for some people that's deliberate. Carey also described another study that documented unconscious feelings influencing behavior. He said in 2006, researchers had Northwestern University students recall an unethical deed from their past, like betraying a friend, or they were asked to talk about a virtuous one, like returning lost property. Afterwards, the students had the choice of a gift. They could take an antiseptic wipe or they could take a pencil. And what they found was that those who had been asked to recall bad behavior, something they felt bad about, an ethical violation they felt they had committed, were twice as likely to take the wipe versus the pencil. So think of it, in some ways they've been primed to psychologically feel like they had to cleanse their conscience because they had just talked about some instance in which they behaved in a way where they felt badly about themselves. And the people that were asked to talk about a way in which they felt good about themselves were much more likely to take the pencil. But how interesting is that, that given the choice of a pencil or a wipe, the people who had just felt bad about themselves took a wipe, which is, of course, symbolic of the feeling that you need to cleanse yourself. So, clearly a lot of things are going on underneath our conscious awareness that influence our behavior. There's tons of studies that also show the role of the unconscious in our decision making. For example, a liquor store would play, they had German and French wines in one part of the store. Some days they would play German music. Some days they would play French music. What do you think happened? Obviously, on the days they played French music, people were much more likely to pick French wine. On the days that they played German music, they're much more likely to pick German wine. And it's to the extent that 2/3 of the people picked the wine that went along with the music that was being played. 2/3 picked the German wine when they played German music. 2/3 picked the French wine when they were playing French music. So subtle, but obviously had an impact. 2/3 of the people fell under the sway of that music. You may not know this, but the stock market goes up on days when it is sunny outside. That may be because investors are more willing to take risks, but just the weather can affect how people behave. A light touch, if you just touch somebody briefly on their shoulder, can increase a person's willingness to get up and dance. If you are asking them for a dance, tap them slightly on the shoulder, greater likelihood they'll answer. Tap somebody on the shoulder lightly, and again, the greater likelihood they'll sign a petition that you have. And they're more apt to also give a generous tip. So if you're a weight person, and you think to just touch somebody on their shoulder, it would likely lead to an increase in the tip that you receive. They also found that when people did a Google search for political candidates, you know how Google puts things in a particular order. So the first 5 things that come up, you didn't pick it. Google's telling you might typed in candidates for governor of New Jersey, up come these results that Google picks. What they found was that people would be more favorable toward candidates who came up higher in the search engine. In other words, those showed up at the top of the search engine. In fact, who showed up at the top of the search engine could influence people's opinions about a candidate by as much as 20 to 50%. And that's not something you have any control over. That's Google picking the order in which you see things. And it could sway people's vote by as much as up to 50%, which is really telling. There's an eye-opening documentary that I would really suggest you look at that looks at how social media is manipulating us, not only just to get us to buy things, but they're also playing on our fears. They're fueling fears that are probably fostering the political divide we see in this country, that they really target social media. They really target information that they think you're going to be more open to. So if you're depending on which way you lean, you'll probably get stuff from Google that reinforces your beliefs. And so that really does begin to sway people, and it also deepens their level of animosity toward the other. So it's called The Social Dilemma. I can't recommend it enough, but it really talks about how social media is feeding the fears that are dividing us and also manipulating us so that we'll buy certain products. I know when somebody told me about this, they said, you'll probably never get on the internet again. Fortunately, I can't afford to not get on the internet because I do a lot of research on it. But it's something we should be aware of because it's playing in the background and it is having a profound influence on us. So those are some examples of the ways in which the unconscious mind influences our behavior. Sometimes by just the subtlest little priming, think of something good that happened today. Hold my warm cup of coffee, a light touch. We're profoundly influenced by things that we don't even consciously recognize are influencing us. The existence of a subconscious mind is also evident in what we call the placebo effect. Now, you may know this, but a placebo is basically a kind of harmless pill. It's medicine, it's an injection, some kind of procedure that you're told will be helpful to you, but in fact has no therapeutic benefit whatsoever. That's what a placebo is. It's a harmless pill or medicine or procedure that's prescribed more for psychological benefit than for any physiological benefit. So they have found that people who are given, say, sugar pills or an injection that has nothing in it actually tend to get a reduction in symptoms if they're told that the medicine is going to have a profound influence on them. So they found that if the doctor said this is powerful medicine, they also found if it was more expensive and if it had certain colors, if it looked more high end, the placebo effect was even stronger. So people are actually being given something that really is not going to have a chain effect on their physiological well-being, but because they believed it would, it did. So you found that what we really got, even with placebo effects, there's lots of research on this, was that it profoundly reduced people's symptoms, even though there's no physiological reason why it should. They have found this using placebos with migraine headaches. cancer-related fatigue, depression, pain, sleep disorders, irritable bowel, even Parkinsonian symptoms, and menopause. They have found that given a placebo, people got better. And now I'm quoting, Dr. Herbert Benson of Harvard University estimates that placebos yield beneficial results for up to 90% of diseases. Clinical studies have shown that they're effective for up to 60% of subjects suffering from ailments such as pain, depression, and ulcers. In one study, doctors painted warts with a dye and told patients that they would disappear. Not surprisingly, the warts really did later vanish consistently, despite the fact that the dye had no medicinal quality whatsoever. So the placebo effect is profound. If people think something's going to benefit them, there's a greater likelihood it will benefit them. And there's studies that show that if the doctor's more convincing and the person really buys into it, it's even more likely to lead to a reduction in symptoms. But the placebo effects are not imaginary. Placebos actually lead to real physiological changes. Now I'm quoting Andy Hunter in an article. The placebo effect isn't all in the mind, as some mistakenly claim. After patients with inflamed intestines were treated with a placebo, over half of them reported improvement, which was verified by a sigmoidoscopy. They actually found that there was actual reduction in the inflammation. Placebos can open airways in asthmatics. Placebos said to contain pain relievers can actually cause the release of actual opioids that are in the body. The pain's natural pain relievers. And all of these are real verifiable physiological changes in the body that are being caused by the brain. The brain believes you've been given something that's going to help you. The brain actually helps you to get better. We'll talk some more about this. But there's some suggestion that probably what's happening is the placebo effect is, it's not in some ways unleashing the natural ability we have within our bodies to heal ourselves. And it's working with the non-conscious mind, and the unconscious mind is a pivotal part of that. And I'm going to talk more about this in a few minutes, but there's a man, Dr. Howard Shrubner, who wrote a book called Unlearn Your Pain. And it's the whole premise of his approach to pain and other chronic conditions, that there are subconscious forces affecting that illness. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But guess what I want to say is, we're talking about whether there's evidence of the unconscious mind. The unconscious mind is mostly visible to us through its influence on our fears, our feelings, our behaviors, and our thoughts. We can't get an image of it when we scan the brain, but you can see that things that influence us prove that things can be running at an unconscious level and have a profound impact on us. So researchers have shown that priming, which is introducing one stimulus to affect another, how people respond to another, and subliminal messages and images that aren't even consciously perceived, actually can alter our behavior, our judgment, and even our physical health. So the unconscious mind can contribute in good ways to people's decisions, but it can also lead to negative decisions, negative outcomes. And that's why it's so crucial to really understand the role of the unconscious mind, because it can be harnessed for good or it can be used against you. So why do we need to understand the role of the subconscious mind in our lives? Well, most of our day-to-day operations, like driving a car, or talking, or walking, or doing dishes, are automatic. They don't require a lot of conscious thought. And those kind of routine activities are a product of really kind of learned neural pathways or patterns in our brain, in the subconscious part of our mind, that they kind of run in the background. We don't have to think about them in order to do those tasks. And now I'm quoting, the subconscious mind is habitual. It has programs in it. It has habits. These habits will play automatically without us thinking about them. So that's why even trying to make change through small changes can be turned into habits if they're done repeatedly. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes when we talk about how to harness the power of the unconscious mind. Little changes in your life, even if it's just to walk for 5 minutes every day, that small change done day after day after day, even if it's not the big one you want to create, will eventually lead to the bigger habit, because once it becomes habitual and it becomes a habit, your unconscious mind will just run that program all the time. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. So our unconscious behavior really is helpful in the sense that we can do a lot of things throughout our day that we don't have to really pay attention to, put a lot of effort into, because they're programs that just run unconscious. But our subconscious can also shape behaviors in ways that are self-defeating or counterproductive. And that's really what we want to focus on. You know, most of us think that humans are very rational human beings, that our actions and behaviors are understood within that lens. You know, we're rational people, and this is why we do the things we do. But the reality is that most behavior seems to defy rational thinking. We all struggle with habits or patterns that we would like to get rid of that we know are irrational, but just knowing they're irrational doesn't turn them off. So we really aren't little computers. And I think that's kind of a good thing. I like that we're not little computers. I like that we have idiosyncrasies and things like that. I don't want to be a little computer, but I want to have a little more control over the idiosyncrasies if I can. So think about it. How often have you had a behavior you wanted to change? You tell yourself it's irrational. I don't want to keep doing it. And you still can't stop doing it. Well, that's because there are more unconscious forces that are at play. The wonderful book I recommend by a guy named Wilson called Strangers to Ourselves, Discovering the Adaptive Subconscious, approximates that approximately 95% of our thoughts, our feelings, and our memories live in our subconscious mind. 95%. 95% of what really drives us is not always within our conscious awareness, which I think is a pretty startling claim. And what they say is that the human brain can absorb like a million, 11 million bits of information in a split second. 11 million bits of information are absorbed by our brain in 1 second. But the conscious mind can only process about 40 of those 11 million bits of information. That's pretty startling. So things are coming into our brain, they're registering in our brain, but for the most part, we're only aware of a very small fraction of those things. They estimated how much is coming in any split second by kind of looking at the number of receptors that we have on each of our sensory organs and that send signals to our brain. I wondered how they came up with that 11 million. So they estimated the number of receptors we have on our sensory organs that are feeding information into the brain. The eye alone takes in 10 bits of information every second, 10 million bits of information every second. The eye alone takes in 10 billion bits of information every second. So our brain is literally bombarded with information. And it's really our subconscious mind that processes all of it and decides which of that information should be passed on to the conscious mind. The unconscious mind is sort of the engine of information processing. Much more is recorded in the unconscious mind, obviously, than the conscious mind. That's why subliminal messages that can be picked up by the subconscious mind, even though they're only flashed for a millisecond and aren't obvious to our conscious mind, still do register in our unconscious mind, and they affect our behavior. Subliminal messages will affect what people do, even though they didn't consciously realize they got a message. They used, I think this is going way back, I remember reading about this. They used a message, bear with me, it sounds hokey. They used a message that said, "Mommy and I are one." And they used it with people who had addiction issues and other psychological issues. And it was flashed subliminally. And then they tested whether their levels of anxiety went down. What they found was that subliminal message of feeling like you were bonded and cared for really had a profound impact on people's levels of anxiety. And they weren't even aware that they had seen that message. I don't have that research in here. It's something I read about many, many years ago, but it's the same idea. Subliminal messages are picked up by our unconscious mind, even when our conscious mind hasn't even taken them in. And that's what's going on when you're getting bombarded with all this information. It really is the subconscious that decides in some ways what goes to the conscious mind. And the subconscious mind also reacts much more quickly than the conscious mind to events. So you may see something black wiggling on the ground and you jump back because your unconscious mind has already decided that could be a snake. You haven't even had that conscious thought yet. So if we're triggered by something that seems frightening to us, the amygdala, the part of the brain that's associated with emotion, responds much more quickly than the conscious mind even realizes. So a snake, that doesn't seem like such a bad thing, right? You want to see a snake and you want to jump backwards. But our subconscious mind also perceives danger in things that aren't necessarily dangerous. For example, the face of an angry person who reminds us of an angry parent. Now, maybe you should be worried about an angry person, but what I'm saying is you can be psychologically triggered by things that don't even really represent danger currently, but your subconscious mind associates them with danger and you respond as if you're in danger. We'll get into that a little bit more. Shrubner, who's the one who I was talking about, who wrote the book called Unlearn Your Pain, he cites a number of studies in which manipulated behavior using subliminal messages. And again, these are things that flash so quickly, the conscious mind doesn't know that they've seen them. In one study, for example, people who were presented with the following words subliminally: old, wise, retired, gray, walked more slowly out of the exam room than people who were shown random words. So literally the way people felt as they walked out of the room, they walked out as much more of an old person if they had words flashed in front of their face that said they were old. I've seen that study replicated in a lot of other ways. So think about it, the words you're playing in your own head about your aging probably are going to have a profound impact on you as well. Another study, people who were shown a very aggressive words interpreted the behavior of others as much more hostile than a control group that were shown kind of random words. They weren't as likely to think people were hostile. So the unconscious mind kind of acts like a spotlight on it, draws you to the information it thinks is most relevant. But not surprisingly, its selection is often shaped by past experiences and what it considers important to your physical and emotional well-being. Now, sometimes that can be a good thing. I'm quoting now from an article. When it comes to maintaining a sense of well-being, we're the ultimate spin doctors of information. We will twist, confuse, contort, and ignore whatever information we need to maintain our sense of self. I think what they're referring to is you don't want to think of yourself as a bad person. You kind of overlook or don't notice the times when you're not necessarily being such a good person. Daniel Gilbert refers to this as the psychological immune system, which fires up whenever we need to protect our psychological well-being. So he says we have ways of sort of processing information that serve us in terms of still feeling good about ourselves. Now, that's one example in which the unconscious is helping us. I see far more instances in which the unconscious is working against us. And it's, our unconscious mind is trying to protect our well-being. But in some instances, what it thinks is bad for us is based on problematic conclusions that we reached when we were just kids on how to stay safe. Okay, so I think in many ways, the problematic behaviors that we get caught up in have to do with they are coping strategies or they're based on beliefs we made when we were just small kids. For example, if the people who were supposed to take care of you, people you're supposed to be able to trust when you were growing up actually hurt you, you may unconsciously be reluctant to trust people. I don't think it's hard to figure out why you would feel that way. It can create a reluctance to ask for help when you asked for help as a kid or you had a need that needed tending to and nobody was there to care about it, to take care of it or respond to you, then what you had to do is just withdraw and pretend you didn't have that need. So now as an adult, you often don't know what you really need. It was too painful as a child to not have those needs met. So as children, we sort of had to bury it and pretend, oh, I never really needed it in the first place. We grow up to be adults who find it hard to say to people, I need something. So much of what we believe about ourselves and others is really drawn from information in the unconscious that was downloaded when we were very, very young. So this is really important to keep in mind. We learn about ourselves, we learn about relationships, we learn about what keeps us safe, we learn about what wins us love from the people we observe as children, mothers, fathers, siblings, other significant adults. And we're too young to really understand the bigger picture. So for example, and you've heard me use this example before, a father who tells their child they're stupid. You may know as an adult now that he said that because he had his own feelings of insecurity. But when you're a little kid and you're told you're stupid, you swallow that whole. You don't have that bigger picture. Somebody tells you stupid, you believe it. You believe it and it starts to become a part of what you believe about yourself. I told this example once when I was on a radio station here in Rehoboth. And when I was done doing a little bit of a talk, I got off the station and here comes this man running in and he's like, oh my God, I raced here to get here. I'm so glad I could meet you. He said, I'm a Philadelphia police officer. I did really well in my life. I rose through the ranks to a high level. But you know what? My father told me I was stupid every day of my life. And to this day, I still believe I'm stupid. So I was so struck by the fact that this man, could see that this had been something that stuck to him from such a young age that no matter how much he accomplished, he always sort of had his father down in the back of his head telling him he was stupid. So, we download these experiences when we're just little kids and we can't decipher the reason for the messages. We just believe them. Gustafson wrote, of the downloaded behaviors acquired before the age of 7, the vast majority, or 70%, are programs of limitation, disempowerment, and self-sabotage. These programs were acquired from other people, not from ourselves. Again, being subconscious, these programs are occurring without our conscious recognition and awareness. So he's saying 70% of what we absorb as kids is not stuff that's empowering. It's actually stuff that makes us feel bad about ourselves or limits us or, causes us to engage in self-sabotage. So he says, therefore, though we have the perception in our mind that we are controlling our lives with our wishes and our desires, the truth is far from that. Since thought causes 95% of our cognitive behaviors to be controlled by the subconscious, meaning below conscious awareness, the mind's invisible behaviors, we struggle to manifest our conscious wishes and desires. So throughout our childhood, we gathered many different memories and experiences that form the fears, the beliefs, the insecurities that we carry today. However, you may not even be able to recall most of those memories that laid those things into our brain, although you may. But the reality is, you may think that people always say to me, "Isn't the past behind me?" And I say, "I really wish it was. I really wish it was. I wouldn't mind being out of job. I'll go be a stand-up comic or something." But it's not behind us. It's running in the back of our mind. It's running in the subconscious. Part of the reason we can't recall sometimes pivotal events from our childhood or understand why they're still affecting us is because the way in which those experiences were stored in our brain when we were little. I was listening to this woman. I attended a workshop put on by Janina Fisher. She wrote a wonderful book called Healing the Fragmented Self of the Trauma Survivor. And it's really about how we have to break off parts of ourselves to survive a trauma and hide them away. And yet we need to go back and get those parts because they're running our behavior at a subconscious level. She explains that in trauma in childhood is primarily recorded in the right hemisphere of the brain. While we are born with both a right and a left hemisphere, we are right hemisphere dominated for most of our childhood. So right hemisphere tends to be the sort of creative part of the brain. Remember the book Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. The left side of the brain tends to be the executive functionings, the sort of, cognitive, structured, organized part of the brain. But we don't have left brain dominance until we're older. She says left brain dominance is achieved only very gradually over the course of the first 18 years of your life. In addition, the corpus callosum, which is that bridge between the two hemispheres, it develops very slowly, and it doesn't really become fully elaborated until around the age of 12. So that means that the right and the left hemisphere aren't communicating well when we're young, up to the age of 12. And here's what's interesting. The right hemisphere of the brain, it doesn't have words. It's a visual part of the brain. It can read body language, it can read facial expressions, but it doesn't record memory in the sense of words. It's not a word. The language is on the left side of the brain. The right hemisphere of the brain doesn't have words. So traumatic memories are recorded in the right hemisphere of the brain outside of our awareness. And this realm represents, and I'm quoting here, the traumatic memories in imagistic form, along with the survival behavior employed as a result of this abuse. So what she's saying is, you didn't record it on the right hemisphere of your brain in words, you recorded it in images, which is partly why sometimes people will talk to me about their childhood and they have flashes, pictures they can kind of see, but they can't really tell me what they think for sure is happening because it was recorded in a part of the brain that doesn't use words, it uses images. The other thing that gets recorded in the right hemisphere of the brain is the survival mechanisms we develop as a result of that abuse. So we develop coping strategies. It might be to stay very quiet, to not draw attention to ourselves. It might be to be a people pleaser. It might be any number of things that we developed as ways to cope with the abuse. That's recorded in the right hemisphere of the brain. But the thing is, the left hemisphere of the brain is not aware of it. So it allows for the emotional learning of the right hemisphere of the brain, especially what we learned in response to stressful, threatening experiences, is only known to the left hemisphere of the brain. It's not known, to the right hemisphere of the brain, not to the left hemisphere of the brain, which is the executive functioning and word-based part of the brain. So what she's suggesting is that when there are painful or traumatic experiences, we store them in a brain that causes them to remain pretty unconscious. But the survival tactics that we developed in response to those trauma, they still exist, but they're not known to the left hemisphere of the brain. We can't put them into words. They're survival mechanisms. They still give rise to our behavior. They still contribute to the ways we act even now, but they're stored in the right hemisphere of the brain, which means you really are not very likely to have a lot of conscious awareness of them. What Dr. Fisher is suggesting then is, again, the brain stores traumatic memories in ways that can make them even more unconscious. And the survival tactics that we develop to respond to that trauma also play on a very unconscious level. Most of our behaviors, our feelings, psychological, and even our physical symptoms make sense if we can tie them back to the original experience that gave rise to them. People say, I do this thing and it's so crazy, I don't know why I can't stop it. And I'll say, if we really understood why you developed it, it won't seem so crazy. It will make sense. It was a survival tactic. It will make sense if we can put it back in its original context. Now, Fisher doesn't believe that you necessarily have to be able to ever gain access to those memories. She said you can just work with how they're manifesting today and assume that they developed in response to something that was difficult, neglect, abuse, something that affected you. And it may not be that important to get the conscious memories of those things, to work with how to change your responses to those. Um, so it's kind of difficult to change our behavior if our unconscious believes that they're necessary to our survival. So many of the behaviors that no longer serve us as an adult, they persist because on an unconscious level, the thought of giving them up feels dangerous. Think about it. If these are the ways you coped with trauma or upset or neglect as a child, giving them up now in your unconscious mind, not necessarily in your conscious mind, they don't feel dangerous. It feels dangerous to continue them. But in your unconscious mind, it feels very dangerous because you're basically giving up a coping strategy. That's why change is so hard, difficult. For example, if you're using alcohol or drugs or food to numb out your feelings, because being numb was the only way you could survive a difficult childhood, your unconscious is terrified of losing this coping strategy. On a conscious level, we know it's hurting us to keep doing these things, but at a deeper level, it feels like the only life preserver we had when we were a kid. And unfortunately, it feels like the only life preserver we have now. If we learned not to lean on other people as a kid because nobody was really there for us and it hurt too much to be disappointed, we find it hard to lean on people now. As I like to say, as we age, we're going to have to learn how to tolerate being vulnerable and letting other people care for us because of our declining health. So if you learn not to lean on people, you better start learning to be a little better at it because we will all need to lean on people as we age. If you can't relax because you're always had to be on the alert as a kid, you always had to watch to see if mom's in a bad mood or dad's about to explode or dad's getting to that level of drunk where he gets mean. If you had to develop that kind of constant awareness as you were a child, you can't just turn that off. That hypervigilance is part of who you are as an adult, and it contributes to not being able to just relax. When somebody says, do you just relax? It's infuriating because it's just not that easy. If you were taught that it wasn't okay to get angry or to feel sad or feel scared, then you buried those feelings. You had to bury them as a kid because they weren't acceptable and they might be punished or nobody was going to respond to them. And that was just so painful that the only way we could cope was just to bury them. But the thing about feelings is you don't bury them dead, you bury them alive. And they come out in other ways. I always say we push them underground, but they're going to sneak back up in other ways because those feelings need an outlet. That's part of the reason therapy so often focuses on looking at and uncovering childhood experiences and their role in current problems, because really most of our problematic behaviors are coping strategies that served us well when we were kids, but we can't give them up now. I'm going to quote, unpleasant emotions, unwanted thoughts, hidden beliefs that nevertheless influence behavior, unproductive behavior patterns, fears, all are a problem people bring to therapy in the hope of relief. Most problems resist the simple desire for change because they have some component that makes sense with memories or beliefs stored at a level below conscious awareness. So you can't understand why you can't just stop doing this, whatever annoying habit you're trying to change. It's because they make sense to some other part of the subconscious. So understanding the deeper roots of problems is really essential to creating lasting changes that are really driven by the unconscious mind. So I have people beat themselves up. They're like, I can't stop doing this thing. I know I should just stop doing it. And I always say that thing that you're embarrassed about, that habit, it's really a gift because it's a gift from your insides. It's an encoded message, but it's trying to tell you, you still hurt somewhere inside. Something happened to you. Something happened to you that needs to be attended to. And that's your little encoded message from your subconscious. And instead of beating yourself up, you need to look at it with eyes of compassion, because that's the only way you can truly change. Oh, I'm so aware of the time. I also want to say you don't have to have undergone significant trauma to have internalized messages that hurt your sense of self or created distorted beliefs about others or interfere with your ability to have good relationships. And I'm quoting now, and this is from Dr. Shrubner in his book about pain. Every child, even if not overtly abused, gets hurt in some way. When parents get divorced or argue, when parents are critical or withhold love or give only conditional love, these actions produce pain for their children. Similar reactions can occur in response to taunting or teasing by siblings or other children. He said, one of the most common symptoms I hear when I evaluate patients is, I never felt loved by my parents, or I often felt that my father or my mother would only love me if I behaved in certain ways. So it doesn't have to be horrible, overt abuse. It doesn't even have to be intentional, but things that are hurtful to a child are experienced much more intensely. And it doesn't matter if they weren't intentional, they still shape what you believe about yourself and you believe about other people. Understanding the role of the unconscious mind could also provide new pathways to your physical well-being. There's something called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. It was done with a large sample of Kaiser Permanente insurance clients, been replicated many times. What they found was as the number of adverse events from childhood increased, so the more negative experiences you had as a child, the greater the likelihood you had health problems in the future. As the number of adverse events increased, so did behaviors that jeopardized health, such as smoking, drinking, and drug use, and as did the documented health problems. The health problems that are associated with adverse childhood experiences include depression, heart disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, and shortened lifespan. Over 65 other studies have now replicated these findings. Um, Wonderful book I would recommend called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. He really looks at the biological impact of traumatic events. And I'm not going to have time to go into it, but look at my handout. Trauma really sparks a host of biological changes in your body, including sort of an overly reactive autonomic nervous system. And that hypersensitive and hyper-aroused autonomic nervous system leads to all kinds of medical problems and inflammation in the body. He said, even after the traumatic events are over, the trauma lives on in the body. He suggests that the memory of trauma is encoded in the viscera, in the heartbreaking and gut-wrenching emotions, in autoimmune disorders and skeletal muscle problems. A hyperactive and overly sensitive autonomic system, among other reactions, create a host of problems years after trauma. All right, I know we're going to have to wind down. Let me talk about how we can harness the power of the unconscious mind. First of all, we need to recognize its influence, and then we need to link its origins to our past. Psychotherapy is an obvious way to do this, but psychotherapy is helpful for making the unconscious conscious, but you can do this on your own. I think it's helpful to do it with another person, but you don't have to do it. There's workbooks, there's things you can use. But the second step in terms of identifying those unconscious forces is develop compassion for yourself, for your current self and your younger self. You develop these coping strategies because you weren't getting the love, the support, and the guidance you needed. So start from a place of compassion and looking at these, because you don't want to replicate the abuse or the neglect that you already received when you went through them. So this time, when you revisit them, bring with you a caring part of yourself. I'll give you an example of Gary Vanderdam traces the influence of an experience of shame, such as being bullied in front of your peers through your lifetime. So this, I'm quoting from him now. Perhaps something embarrassing happened in grade school. Other kids teased you or you were bullied. This left you with a feeling of shame, unworthiness, or anger at others. Your mind learned a set of associations. Your mind learned that getting attention by a group of people means you will feel the same emotions of fear and shame. Like a Pavlov's dog response, your mind begins to produce a response of shame, unworthiness, or anger if a group of people are paying attention to you. You might begin to feel that these emotions if you think about a situation where people will be paying attention to you. Your mind is firing neural pathways together with emotions associated with a learned stimulus in your memory. You probably always learned to hide these feelings, he goes on to say. You also learned that it wasn't good to have these feelings or express them, so you repressed them so they wouldn't come out. To cover up the feelings of shame, fear, or hurt, perhaps you also learned to be likable by pleasing others, worked hard to be professionally competent, or became the comedic class clown, making other people laugh. You mask the unworthiness with a positive behavior and image for getting good attention. Perhaps it works for many years and you do it automatically. So automatically, it seems like the real you. This may be part of your normal personality, but underneath is the belief, I have to behave this way or people won't like me, they will criticize me, and then I will feel hurt and ashamed. You might feel trapped or resentful in a positive pattern of protection. So you always have to be so good. After a while, it begins to feel like a cage. As the masking or compensation strategies become more professional, being more professional or doing things to make others like you can be a good thing. But when it is overdone, which often happens when it is a strategy for covering other emotions, you can burn out or become resentful. Finally, perhaps you want to let go of being perfect or trying too hard to get people to like your strategy. You notice that when attempting to change these behaviors, you feel uncomfortable and fall back into them. You just can't seem to help yourself. Behaviors like this aren't objects you can pick up and change because they're anchored to unconscious beliefs and emotions. That trying to get others to like you or the perfectionism is part of how you repressed emotions of unworthiness, shame, and anger. Removing the masking strategy means that you will feel more of the unworthiness and shameful emotions. So he's just saying, here's an experience of being shamed as a child and how it continues to influence your life. I'll just go a few more minutes and we'll stop. There's a few other techniques you can use for gaining access to your unconscious. Ask yourself questions like, when did this behavior start? What am I afraid will happen if I stop this behavior? Will people stop loving me? Will people stop respecting me? What did I learn from my mother or father growing up that may play a role in this problem that I'm having? What things did I learn that I had to do to win love or affection from other people? What am I most critical of myself about? What's my greatest fear and how might it be linked to my past? What makes me sad and how that might be linked to my past? And what makes me angry? And how is that linked to the past? So step one is identify those unconscious forces. Step two is look at them with compassion as coping strategies they are. And the third piece is really about releasing those limiting beliefs and those feelings. Because I believe for most problematic behaviors, they're really anchored in place by strong emotions that you had to deal with when we were very little. So sadness over not being seen or validated as a child drives you to be a people pleaser. Your psyche fears you will feel all that sadness all over again if you don't keep pleasing people. Anger at a parent that wasn't safe to express makes you an adult who avoids situations where you might feel angry. It interferes with your ability to be assertive. Fear that you had as a child that was ignored or even punished, don't be a wimp, may lead to avoiding things that make you feel vulnerable or afraid now. So these emotions need to be safely expressed. They need to be witnessed and responded to in healthy, caring ways. Um, it's helpful to have someone else do that with you, but you can do it for yourself. But these hurt feelings have to be released because they're really keeping you stuck in unproductive behavior patterns. And you also may need to be able to see that you can tolerate those feelings. As a child, you didn't feel like you could tolerate those feelings. So you really had to develop a defensive strategy to not feel them. But you know what? Now you're an adult. You need to sit down and cry over the fact that you weren't loved as a child. Sit down and cry. You need to smash ice cubes against a brick wall to safely let your anger out. Let yourself do that. There are always safe ways to get your emotions out. And you need to learn that you can stand those feelings, that you bring to this challenge now your adult wisdom and the support of other people. So fear of feeling those feelings could keep you stuck in those coping strategies, but you now have the internal strength and external support to face them. All right, better just say a few of the headlines and you can look at the handout and then I better stop. You need to change the beliefs you have by changing the messages you're playing in your head all the time. A final important step then is to talk to this younger part of yourself and tell them things like what you were taught was wrong growing up. You are lovable. It wasn't your fault these things happened. You don't have to be perfect. It's okay to be human. So you can imagine sitting and talking to that inner child. You can write a letter to that part of you. You can use affirmation, list 3 things you really wish you had heard growing up. And when you catch yourself beating yourself up, I want you to, or about to engage in something that's counterproductive, stop and talk to yourself with compassion. Don't beat yourself up. It's only going to fuel the behavior, not make you feel better. Change like this takes time. The one way to tap the power of the unconsciousness is also to try to make changes through small goals, small achievable goals. I did a whole talk on this, but you'll see more about your handout. Even if you just walk for 5 minutes every day, even if you just put your sneakers on every day and don't walk, those little behaviors will start to become habits in your brain. And that's how you change real condition. If you suffer from chronic pain or any other kind of chronic condition, I want you to check out Howard Schrubner's book, Unlearn Your Pain. You can do the program using that book. You can do that program online. And he says that past injuries that aren't healed, that have healed, but you're still having pain from, has to do with some neural circuit between that site and your brain that has to be interrupted. It's not in your head, you're having the pain, but it's in your brain, and you can stop that circuit so you don't continue to have that pain. But he also looks a great deal at identifying other unconscious influences that are really often at the root of a lot of medical conditions. Please check out his website. If you want to be successful moving towards something, link it to a burning desire or a strong emotion. The subconscious responds to strong emotion. Someone wrote, communicating thoughts from your conscious mind to your subconscious mind is difficult because it should be done with emotion. Only the thoughts that are conveyed with genuine emotion makes it to the back of your mind. And only the thoughts that are backed up by strong emotions stay there. So if you have a goal that you really want to reach, tie it to a strong emotion. There's a lot of personal coaching people that also talk about tapping the power of the subconscious. Tony Robbins, Joel Richardson. I've given you their books on your handout. Okay, Carl Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will drive your life, and you will call it fate. And lastly, you have to begin by posing questions to your unconscious mind, and then listening very carefully for the answers. If you pose the right questions and listen well, you can begin to tap into the power of your subconscious mind.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation today, Dr. Judy. It was
And next
very
month,
educational. Yes,
we're
go
going to
ahead.
talk next month, we're going to talk about coping with the holidays.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us today.
Okay,
Bye,
thanks a
everybody.
lot. Thank you
Good to
much.
yourselves. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.